From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Senator Tim Scott releases a plan to rev the U.S. economy as Governor Ron DeSantis rolls out an energy proposal and Vice President Mike Pence gives a speech on foreign policy. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board members Kate Batchelder-Odell and McNamee Ukwe-Barua. A few weeks ago, I was complaining that the 2024 presidential race was a policy-free zone, but I guess my ship has now come in. 4 candidates in recent days laying out big platform planks. Let's start with South Carolina Senator Tim Scott. He has a 5-page economic plan called Build, Don't Borrow. And here's the man himself last week on CNBC explaining one piece of it.
What we're seeing in the Biden years is even though we have had a lower tax environment, when you have $2 trillion of overspending or 40% more spending than revenues come in, of course, you're going to have a large deficit. That's why we are looking at a $2 trillion deficit this fiscal year. It's not simply a revenue problem, it's a spending problem. That's why my plan, not only does it cut taxes, it cuts spending. We have to get back to the pre-pandemic level of spending when it comes to non-defense discretionary spending. That's the way we right the ship.
Kate, what is in this proposal by Senator Tim Scott? I know you've taken a look at it, and what do you make of it as policy?
Well, Kyle, congratulations on getting the results you've been yearning for and getting the candidates to focus on the policy substance. Tim Scott has jumped in here with this plan, and it's got a lot of moving parts, and I would call it a lot of great stuff, but a sort of a mixed bag. It is not anchored in one particular item, though I think that pitch he just laid out, that Washington has a spending problem, not a revenue problem, is a potent one. Revenues are pretty healthy according to historical averages, but it's spending that is really at record highs. So a couple specifics on what's in the Scott plan. I think some real highlights. The first one would be his focus on welfare reform and opportunity. We know that America has a problem with prime-age men who are not in the labor force and who are not working at all. So he floats a welfare reform 2.0 that would strengthen work requirements on some of these programs and try to get more people back into the labor force and try to help more Americans be upwardly mobile. So that is a great optimistic message that I think is potent. Now, I thought he showed great courage on trade by saying he doesn't support the kind of blunt trade wars that Donald Trump has been suggesting, like a 10% tariff. And he thinks that that would be good for China. And I think that's exactly right. And we can talk more about that and how really a trade deal in Asia that left out China, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, would be good for the American economy. Just a couple other quick hits from Scott would be he wants to extend the Trump tax cuts, but he also throws in a bunch of stuff here about support for a balanced budget amendment. There's a lot of different ideas, some good, some not, but I think give him credit for getting specific on some of this stuff. But I think he needs, what he should do is kind of fill out more details and really anchor this in a core proposal. And my idea for that would be a 15% corporate tax rate, or something that you can really hang your hat on and give kind of unifying theme, as opposed to just 5 pages of some bills you've put out and some good ideas and some mixed bagged ideas. Really start to drill down on a specific economic vision for the country.
This is a bit of a potpourri, and I would encourage listeners to go find this 5-pager themselves and take a look at it. The balanced budget amendment is something that is just realistically not going to be able to get through Congress and get ratified. He is also talking about eliminating the death tax or the estate tax. And Monet, I would second Kate's argument here on trade. Here is the line from Tim Scott's plan. He says, I will avoid blunt trade wars with our friends and allies that hurt consumers and set us back in the mission of isolating China. If we want to isolate China, we need to hold our friends close and have free and fair trade with our allies that protects both our American jobs and our alliances at the same time. And I do think that that's a bit of a stance, sticking his neck out a little bit, given the way that the Republican Party under President Trump has been trending on trade. And that's a point that I think we could have a real debate about. If President Trump at some point gets on the debate stage with these guys and is standing there next to Tim Scott, that would be good for the party to have a real argument about what Republican trade policy ought to look like.
Well, that's a great point. And I agree that a lot of the parts of the Scott economic plan that Kate reviewed are essentially endorsing core, longstanding Republican Party priorities, which is a very good thing. And I think part of Scott's brand is that he is a down-the-middle-of-the-road conservative who wants to jolt the economy in the ways that Republicans generally have tried to do. But in order to stand above the crowd on the debate stage, he does need to differentiate himself. And one of the ways that he is flirting with doing is by taking a more vocal stance on returning to a free trading position after President Trump, during the course of his 4 years, helped to create a pretty big and pretty vocal constituency against free trade, both among the conservative base throughout the nation, but also among a lot of lawmakers. So far, we haven't seen too many of the presidential candidates embrace a trade restrictionist footing, but they certainly haven't attacked Trump and really drawn a distinction with him in the way that Scott seems to be preparing to do. And so it would be very helpful to point out that not only did President Trump place national security tariffs on China, which increased the cost of importing steel and aluminum, but he also placed tariffs on American allies like the UK, Japan, the EU. And I think that that's something that most Americans really would see as harmful to our alliances with those countries and also to the industries that depend on affordable imports of those metals for production. And so he can really potentially gain a following by saying that we're going to return to free trade and making the case for how that benefits American consumers and also American workers in the vast majority of industries.
A couple other things I would pull out. One of them is a line about the child tax credit. Here is what the Tim Scott plan says. He says, I will sign new pro-life and pro-family tax cuts to support moms, dads, and kids. I will cut taxes for expectant moms even before they give birth. See my Child Tax Credit for Pregnant Moms Act. And if you click through to the link there, it is a bill offered by Republican Senator Steve Daines and I believe co-sponsored by Tim Scott. And it says that the child tax credit would be available for the preceding year if the taxpayer had a child that was born and includes on that return of the tax return, a Social Security number issued for that child before the due date for the tax return, or if the child was miscarried or stillborn and the taxpayer has a certificate of miscarriage or stillbirth issued. And the other thing that I think is interesting about this policy plan, Kate, is just the classic Tim Scott folksiness of it. I don't know that I've ever read a policy proposal with this many exclamation points in it. At one point, he quotes his granddaddy. He says, don't spend what you don't have. If that rule was good enough for my granddaddy, it's good enough for DC. There's another line here where he's talking about overspending, and he quotes Proverbs 22:7, the borrower is slave to the lender. And I think that's interesting in that that is kind of how Tim Scott, I think, comes across when he's speaking to voters in Iowa and New Hampshire, and it shows through even in his policy proposals.
It does. And first, on the first point about the child tax credit, which the Trump tax reform expanded to $2,000, and that does expire back to $1,000 in the coming year. So Tim Scott here says, we'll extend the Trump tax cuts and also create this new way to claim it while moms are still pregnant. And to your point, that does create a lot of complication in the tax code to allow pregnant women to claim it. It also, I think, doesn't really get at the core issue of what is cramping family life in America. For instance, because of the complications in administering a child tax credit for pregnant women, what you end up doing is basically probably having to make it just a windfall the following year. So it's just income redistribution because it's fully refundable if you have no tax liability. So it just gives some taxpayers a larger tax credit in that year after they have a child. I think that the better course of action for Scott would be to focus more on rising living standards, which I think is what people really want for their kids. And so a 3% growth target, I was mentioning things that he could anchor this plan on. A 3% growth target would be a big one. And that kind of gets hooted down in some corners of the right as déclassé and Reaganite in a derogatory sense. But really, it is the broadest way of spreading around prosperity in the country. And what people really want, I think, is opportunity for their children to have a better life and for children to be a little bit more affordable, which I don't think ultimately a tax credit that just reshuffles money around accomplishes. Also, on his kind of general demeanor about the folksiness, if you read his books, you will also see a lot of exclamation points there. Obviously, he wants to appeal to Americans of faith, to people who consider themselves normal, everyday people. And I think he has a compelling way of connecting with people. And I think Americans find his biography and his tagline, "From Cotton to Congress and Two Generations of His Family," really compelling. But at the same time, the balanced budget amendment is a great example because often these are just pretexts for higher taxes. Having a balanced budget doesn't necessarily mean that you are focused on cutting spending or restraining spending or getting the entitlement problem under control. So I think voters want to pair that style that they like about his optimism. They want a sophisticated approach to these issues. So that is, I would encourage him to fill it out with a little more policy detail without losing that charm that people obviously like him for.